Hello, friends. Today I wanted to talk about some of the books I've been reading, namely Ethics by Spinoza. I finished it yesterday. Just going to talk about the book and another book that I read recently, and then I might play some guitar. So that'll be the video. So, Spinoza's Ethics. I assume if you clicked on this video, you're familiar with it. It's very famous. It's getting a lot of people reading it more often these days. Spinoza's just a lot more popular. I mean, he's getting a lot of popularity now, because the ideas he presents are very compelling and very abnormal, I guess. Not like, they're not very traditional, especially for the time that he was writing, which I believe is like, yeah, the 1600s or so. So, anyways, I tried to pick this up back when I was in high school, and it just went really over my head. If you pick it up and you look at it, it will, like, immediately be very, like, intimidating. He has all these definitions at the beginning, and then he has these axioms, and then, you know, throughout the text, he's referencing them. So he's saying, like, for in nature, there is nothing except substances and their affections, as is evident from A1, D3, and D5, but it cannot be produced by a substance, by P6. And so when I started reading this first, I was like, what the hell is he talking about? Am I supposed to remember all of these axioms and, like, things that he's talking about? It was very strange. And so I basically just put the book down and I said, I don't care for this. I also, back in high school, I was like a hardcore atheist. I'm still pretty much an atheist, but back then I was like hardcore atheist. And so, like, reading this and having the whole first chapter be him essentially talking about God, I was like, I don't care for this. This doesn't really do anything for me. He's clearly wrong. Now that I'm reading it now, in my later years, it's definitely not as hard to get into as I thought it would be. You don't have to remember all the definitions and axioms. He explains things pretty well. And his conception of God is one that is very compelling to me. I really did enjoy reading the first bit of this book, where he's talking about God being one substance. That's kind of his whole thing. Again, if you don't really know much about Spinoza, his whole thing is like God is just one substance, and that substance is everything in the universe, essentially. And so, and also that God doesn't have a will, he doesn't have emotions, he doesn't decide anything other than everything that comes through God is necessarily true, is necessarily there because of his nature. At a certain point, people, I mean, famously, Spinoza compares God to nature, which is kind of a vague term. Once you've read Spinoza, you kind of know what he's talking about. But a lot of people have gone back and read Spinoza, especially not very religious people, like atheists like me, would read it and be like, oh, wow, so, God is nature, and not like, it's a very sort of atheistic conception of God, where God is just the universe, He's not like, he doesn't, there's no point in worshiping him, there's no heaven, or hell or demons or whatever, right? So it's a lot more palatable for us. Of course, the people back then at the time of Spinoza also thought so. I mean, I think that he was persecuted for whatever his writings were, because he was seen as an atheist. I read David Hume recently, Treatise on Human Nature, and he talks about Spinoza briefly, and basically just calls Spinoza a atheist, because he's presenting a very materialist argument. Perhaps the first materialist argument, although you can't really, I don't know enough about history or philosophical history to make that claim, but, materialism basically traces its origins to Spinoza as far as I'm concerned, and that's very cool. I would call myself a materialist, although, once I started thinking more about, I started reading some more Heidegger and Husserl, like some phenomenology stuff, I've grown slightly questioning of that. There's just problems with materialism that are really complicated problems that I don't necessarily know how to solve. I'm not super smart at, like, metaphysics, really interesting to me. I can understand the first bit of this book, but after that, once you start getting into really complicated stuff, it kind of starts to go over my head. In any case, after the first section, he gets into the mind. He starts talking about the mind. And I didn't really find this section super compelling, but it is definitely interesting how it connects to the rest of his work, or the rest of his, sort of theory that he's putting out here. I mean, to me, it almost seems as though consciousness, according to Spinoza, is just sort of something inherent to the universe, inherent to the one substance that is God. And so all of our particular minds are just like particular versions of God's mind. I could be wrong on that, but that's kind of the way I interpreted it. And it's definitely, I forget what it's called, but there is definitely like a sort of theory that's emerged recently that's very similar to that, that says that consciousness like exists on the most fundamental level of matter, and so we're just a more complex form of consciousness. But there's not like, everything is conscious basically, just at varying levels, which kind of explains why consciousness would just emerge suddenly, which is a compelling idea. I'm not sure how much I ascribe to it, but I think it's interesting. So anyways, after he talks about the mind, he talks about the affections, which is like the longest section in the book, and probably my least favorite, to be honest, because it's a lot of just talking about this and that emotion and why it's just a combination of pleasure or with an external object or something. It's also very, like, Hume got into this a lot. Like, he had this whole section talking about every, like, emotion, and I just found it really boring and not super compelling. I am sort of compelled by his idea of love, where he says love is nothing but joy with the accompanying idea of an external cause. And I like also his idea that everything comes down to pleasure and pain. He calls it joy and sadness, but I kind of interpret that as just pleasure, pain. Every emotion springs from pleasure and pain. And I like this because it gives us sort of an ethical way to... when you get into sort of utilitarianism or some other ethical frameworks, you start to see that pleasure and pain are like the most base things that exist, and then there's like higher emotions that we feel, and like higher things like, reason, and, well, not reason, but like love typically is up there, and like, for some reason I can't think of examples right now, but like supposedly we're more complex than just pleasure and pain, right? Is what we'd like to believe, but Spinoza is kind of dumbing us down and saying, no, we are really... everything kind of just comes from these two sources. And now, he does separate us from animals. I think that's just a product of his time. But for me, I think what it's showing is that animals and humans really have the same thing in common, pleasure and pain, which is how we judge the world and what we prefer. So even though things that we decide and want and do seem more complicated than an animal, like a dog or a cow, it's really the same thing. It sort of creates this equality between us that I think is good. It's something I've thought about for a bit. Of course, I think getting sort of outside of Spinoza, I think the difference between us and animals is that we have autonomy, an illusory autonomy, because no one has autonomy. Another thing that Spinoza gets into is that we don't have free will, which I also think is a very bold, kind of out there statement for him to make at the time that he was writing. But I mean, especially him being a materialist and me sort of also, pretty much being a materialist. Yeah, we don't have free will. There's really nothing you can say that can prove that we have free will, considering the evidence. Nothing has any will. Nothing truly has any autonomy. But we have the illusion of autonomy within a given social organization. So we socially organize ourselves into a society of people, and within that society, everyone has a certain freedom over the world and over other people. So within the framework of how we live and dictate our lives, we do have free will. And so when it comes to ethics, when it comes to ethical decisions, which really only exist within the social framework, if there was no such thing as social organization, there would be no such thing as law and ethics, right? And so within the social framework, we do have freedom. And you have to respect both the pleasure and pain that other people feel, but also the autonomy that people have, right? In fact, I think autonomy probably comes first, which is why it's not okay to do something against someone's will, even if it's not hurting them, let's say, So, whereas animals don't have autonomy, they don't live within social organization, they just sort of live only via their pleasure and pain and by nothing else. They have no freedom as far as we're concerned. And so it's okay to violate their autonomy, as in keep them, basically use them as a mere means, as Kant would say, to use them for whatever their products are. Chickens for eggs, we can get eggs from chickens. We can keep them in a coop. We're violating their autonomy, but that's okay. Because they don't have autonomy. So that's not something that they operate by. They only operate by pleasure and pain. So if we are violating their pleasure and pain, if we are causing them more pain than they would be in some other circumstance, then we are committing something ethically wrong. And something ethically wrong in that it really it's not separable from human affairs. We don't have heightened pleasure and pain. It's all pleasure and pain, including animals. So we should treat them exactly the same as we do other human beings. We just don't have to consider their autonomy. Anyways, that's a long rant about sort of like the ethical theory I've sort of been thinking about, especially considering Kant, which I haven't read a whole lot of Kant, but I've read enough to understand what he's saying. In any case, back to Spinoza. After the affects, which I don't think I have much else to say about, he goes into human bondage. Yeah, okay, so he gets into human freedom, and he gets really into sort of his real ethical theories. I couldn't help but compare them to Stoicism because they feel very, very similar. And some of it certainly went over my head, but as far as I understand it, it's essentially that it's essential, and he says something that's very similar to what the Stoics said. Basically, you have to align yourself with your nature. And for Spinoza, that means God. I think that's probably also what it meant for Stoics, if you really look into it. So, and God being just the necessary way that things happen, he's basically just saying, as long as we accept what happens to us calmly and understand that we don't have control over external things, then we will have peace of mind. A very Stoic outlook. And so for that reason, since I've already read a lot of Stoicism, I didn't really find his ethics to be all that interesting, in the sense that it's not saying anything that I've never heard before. I can't really get out of Spinoza perhaps what a lot of people are getting out of Spinoza, which is like some sort of revolutionary ideas that he's having, and I can't really see that at the moment, at least. I'm sure that I will sort of come to see Spinoza in a lot of different ways as I learn more about things and sort of understand it more. I also found a lot of parallels to Kierkegaard. If you've ever read Lily of the Pond, Bird of the Air, I think that's what it's called. It's one of his writing, and it's sort of about how the lilies and the birds, they aren't worried about what will happen or if it'll happen this way or that way. They are just within the necessary conditions that also, in Kierkegaard's case, that God has set forth. I think Kierkegaard would also agree that the universe operates, objectively speaking, from God's standpoint, necessarily. So nothing happens that God doesn't will, that is to necessarily happen. So humans should align themselves more with that type of mindset, that everything happens as it does, and we don't have control over that. And so you can see these ideas kind of spring up everywhere, and they also happen a lot of the time connect back to God. And that is one thing that I do like about the idea of God not necessarily being tied to some man in the sky, but it can just be the force of nature, the necessary happenings of everything. It's neither good nor bad. It just is. And we are the ones who assign judgments onto things and say that they're good or bad. Spinoza points that out, very well, in that nothing is really good or bad. We just prefer certain things to other things just based on what, he talks about like things that give us more power, like give our mind more power of acting. Kind of a vague concept, but not one that I will attempt to explain. But yeah, it's good. It's in concluding thoughts, I found the book to be enjoyable, definitely essential stuff. Honestly, I prefer Kierkegaard and I prefer Stoicism, but I do like the metaphysics that he's laying out. It's compelling. I suggest it. I think it's a great book. Again, I assume if you're watching this, you've probably read it. If not, if you're just stumbling upon this randomly and you're interested in Spinoza, then that's really nice of you. You know, it's a really short book. You can pick it up. It's only like, I read it in a week, and I'm a slow reader, so you can probably read it much faster than me. So yeah, I was going to talk about Foucault today because I read Discipline and Punish recently. I think I'll do that in another video because this is already long enough. I will play a song, and then you can stick around. You can't, or if you don't want to, you can leave. So yeah, cool. Hiya there. Okay, so I'm going to play a song I wrote called Set in Stone. I think it kind of relates to what we were talking about with Spinoza, but I'll leave that for you to decide. I also haven't wrote a solo for this on harmonica, but I'm just going to riff, and I hope that it sounds good, and I hope you enjoy. I got a feeling that might be loneliness, but I know that I'm not really alone. I can't see what's right in front of me, but I know that it's not set in stone. Oh, I know that it's not set in stone. Walked outside and I felt a little off. Wind was blowing in a way it never blown. Sometimes I get tired of my thoughts, but I know that it's not set in stone. Oh, I know that it's not set in stone. Haven't spoken any words to my friends. Didn't feel like picking up the phone. Got the bad news a few days ago, but I know that it's not set in stone. Oh, I know that it's not set in stone. Everything looks blurry in my mind, but I never claim to know what is unknown. Only thing that is clear to me now is that nothing seems to be set in stone. Oh, nothing is set in stone. Kind of rough, but we'll take it. Well, there you have it. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time.